Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture on Middle Eastern women and Orientalism. I will be defining Orientalism, or better yet, I'll be having a series of videos do the defining for you. But it's the best way to begin is to study this subject temporally. And so what I've done is divided this subject over 2 weeks. And in the first week, basically the way to divide it is to look at it pre-World War II and post-World War II. If we want to date when the process of Orientalism began, let's say the 1830s when France invaded Algeria. This is the first time a European power has taken territory from one of the gunpowder empires, and that would be the Ottoman Empire. And really the first wave of Orientalism coincides. It's really a process that's parallel with modern imperialism. So it's good as we, this is the last week before the midterm, to review what do I mean by modernity. And modernity is, just to recap, the process of when human societies entered a condition of mass. Anything pre-modern is before that. Okay. Orientalism coincides with the ascendancy of Britain and France as imperialist powers, or in other words, the engines of imperialism. We're particularly going to be looking at France and Britain in the Middle East and the fate of Middle Eastern women as a result of them being embedded or affected by the process of imperialism. So, Orientalism, if it accompanies imperialism, is dealing with a set of power relations. In other words, on one level, Britain and France invade the Middle East. Orientalism is really the culture of imperialism. What culture emerged as a result of Anglo-French domination of the region? I begin with this receipt, Literary Guillotine. You could only find a bookstore like that in Santa Cruz. And look at the book below, Do Muslim Women Need Shaving? It's a typo, it should just be, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Combine that with the Arabian Nights on the top, and there you have Orientalism. Arabian Nights, of course, influenced the Oriental or Middle Eastern imaginary of France and Britain. And now we've already talked about the Arabian Nights as being an inherently misogynistic text. At the same time, during its translation, think who translated it, a British person who knew the Middle East and would have traveled to the Middle East, Richard Burton, when Britain's position in the Middle East was at its ascendancy. In other words, it was conquering parts of the Middle East. Do Muslim women need saving? Is a question proposed in response to often the rhetoric that was imposed by Western or European powers justifying their invasions. When France and Britain first started to enter the Middle East, in other words, in the 1800s, they said, we're not conquering these people. We are saving their women from men who are Middle Eastern and oppressing them. Fast forward to the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, and the same argument is being used. So in other words, what is this book saying? Do Muslim women need saving? Is in questioning the kind of Western justification of intervention in the Middle East. So I began this lecture on Orientalism with, Orientalism, of course, is a system of stereotypes. And to understand these stereotypes, let us go to an article that questions some of the stereotypes that are inherently Orientalist. Sorry, wrong one. Wrong one. Oh, stop sharing. So let's watch the following video called Reality Check.
There are more than 212 million diverse Arab women hailing from 22 countries and territories. Some are pilots, doctors, scientists, and fashion designers.
Now pay attention to this. This is an important setting for this class. Couldn't have said it better myself, and that's why I showed this video, but within what this video unpacked in less than 4 minutes, it's going to take me this entire week's lecture to discuss. So, just to give you the history, Orientalism begins in North Africa. And if you look, how is Orientalism embedded in a larger process of imperialism and colonialism? It works like this. So it all begins, the European conquest of Africa, when France invades Algeria in the 1830s. Okay. Now, here in this case, By 1880, there isn't a single spot in Africa that is not conquered by European power, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. In the case of Liberia, that was a territory that the US said to the other European powers, you can't touch it. That is for freed slaves to go, a country to go back to. And then Ethiopia actually, which was attempted to be conquered by Italy, was actually able to repulse the Italian invasion. What makes imperialism and thus Orientalism modern is this. Number one, look at the mass distances that were conquered. And the conquest of Africa was enabled by two inventions that emerged as a result of the Industrial Revolution: the steam-powered battleship and the machine gun. In fact, that's why Ethiopia was able to defeat Italy. It was able to buy machine guns and basically meet the Italians weapon for weapon. What was the motivation for imperialism? What made it modern? Not only its ability to conquer territories over mass distance. In other words, France doesn't conquer its southern neighbor or go as far as Vietnam and conquer it. Of course, enabled by the steam-powered ship. But imperialism also was cultural. Various British and French citizens who could afford it took part in mass tourism to the lands that the empire conquered. So whether it was British citizens going to Egypt, conquered in the 1880s, the French had the luxury of going to Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, all part of the French Empire. The other mass element was the mass settlement of French people to Algeria. That's colonialism. It's a part of imperialism. So much so that there was an entire population of French in Algiers, that Algeria was incorporated into France proper. Okay. It wasn't considered as a colonial imperial possession, it was considered France. What else makes imperialism modern? Lands were conquered for the process of mass production and mass consumption. Algeria was conquered. Well, let's go to Egypt first. Egypt was conquered for one reason: the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal was important for mass transportation. It cut the time of mass transportation, that is. Egypt was also important for cotton. And what was cotton important for? Well, the mills of Manchester that took raw cotton from Egypt, India, and the American South and churned it into mass-produced textiles, which were not only sold to the British public, but back to the Egyptians, the Indians, and to Americans in the South. So it was about a mass production, mass consumption economy. That's also what makes imperialism modern. Algeria, the coast of Algeria was basically exploited, used to, of course, feed. The coast of Algeria is quite rich in grain, olives. So you had the mass exploitation of Algerian land, the use of Algerian land for mass production, farms of mass production. Okay. Orientalism is the culture that goes along with it. It's the books produced about the French and British domains. It's art produced by the British and French about the domains they've conquered. It's the way, the stereotypes the British and French masses are exposed to about these far-off lands in which Britain and France have conquered. That's Orientalism. It's the culture that accompanies imperialism. So basically, what is Orientalism? Of course, it's a process of mass. What makes Orientalism mass? It's about the mass production of culture, or basically taking the masses of the Middle East, creating them as kind of a single undifferentiated whole, and then mass circulating these images. The book by Edward Said, look at the image that he chose for his cover. Okay. And the best way to explain Orientalism is, again, outsource the work, go to another very good video to tell you what is Orientalism. Oh, hell, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I shared the sound with the first video, so please do watch it on your own. I don't know why I've been making this mistake. But anyway, making a lot recently. Okay, so watch the following introduction.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through the refining fire of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works, not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justification.
And sorry, I hate to interrupt. Literature, the mass production of books, okay? Such as a Jungle Book. A Jungle Book would be considered very much an Orientalist piece of literature written by an Orientalist. What is anthropology that makes it modern? It's a very modern discipline. Well, it basically classifies the world into kind of discrete masses and attributes characteristics to those masses, okay? Okay.
Through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves, the exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype, decode the fiction, unlearn the myth.
The key word in that video was modern culture, okay, you see. And the thing about Orientalism is you have to understand, even though we associate the Orient with the Far East, okay, Orientalism really just refers to how the West sees non-Western cultures in which it dominated. So hence East Asia, Africa, South Asia, Latin America. Orientalism is the lens in which you take the masses of those areas and reduce them, this kind of very reductionist approach to kind of quantify and qualify the essence of these diverse places into kind of unfair and stereotypes. That is the essence of Orientalism. Look at the picture. What did he say? The belly dancer and the snake charmer. That is the kind of tropic element, the metaphor that we often use to refer to the Middle East, okay? Look at this, paintings like this, okay? Here I did just a screenshot from this video. This is an art form that goes along with Orientalism. It's called Orientalist art, okay? And now again, I'm gonna go to the following video to further explain what is Orientalism. Oh wait, let me make sure the sound is on. Don't want to be that. Should be on automatically. Yeah, okay, good. All right, here we go. The previous two videos are produced by a channel based in Qatar known as Al Jazeera.
These is blood issues. Yeah, I butchered that. You've probably heard Cardi B's hit song Bodak Yellow, and like basically everyone else, I couldn't get enough of it. That is until Cardi B released the music video.
These expensive, these is red bottoms, these is bloody shoes.
Did y'all see that? Why is she wearing a hijab with a veil over her face in the middle of the desert? Bodak Yellow shows how music, television, and film still paint Arabs and Muslims in a highly exoticized light. And it's just one example of how Orientalism is pretty much everywhere in our pop culture. Think of Aladdin, think of Homeland, or Sacha Baron Cohen's entire career.
I made that up.
Hi guys, I'm Omar, and this Sunday on AJ Plus, we're breaking down the concept of Orientalism, where it comes from, and why it's a problem. And just know, I'm definitely going to ruin some of your childhood favorites.
I can show you the world.
And now, I'm about to drop a whole new world of knowledge on you. Aladdin was one of the most Orientalist films of all time. And Professor Walter Denny, who's taught Orientalist art for decades, agrees.
Like those first 3 or 4 minutes of the Disney movie Aladdin are basically very prejudicial. They create a very, very false and very, very prejudicial view of the Islamic world.
Before I upset you anymore, let me tell you why it's so bad by explaining what Orientalism is. Historically, Orientalism refers to the study of the Arab and Muslim world, or what was for a long time referred to as the Orient, which included more than just Arab or predominant Muslim societies. And the discipline basically looked at those societies as though they were interchangeable, inferior, and well, mystical and savage. Just the fact we say there's an Arab or Muslim world is proof of how pervasive that way of thinking was and is. But now, Will Yeomans, a professor of media studies and public affairs, says the definition has evolved.
It's become to mean something else, a critique actually of a particular way of knowing about that part of the world.
The late Palestinian-American professor, author, and activist Edward Said wrote the book on Orientalism, making his Palestinian-Arab identity central to his work.
Fanaticism, violence, etc., always associated with the Arabs, with Islam, and so on and so forth. Arabs are always being killed. They're always associated publicly in the public mind, in the public image, with what is negative and regressive.
He called his book Orientalism, and it forever changed the way we think of Western depictions of the Arab and Muslim world. Said also said Orientalism relies on letting Westerners interact with the Orient without ever losing the upper hand. Basically, it's about power.
And his criticism was that the study of it, the scholarship about the Middle East and the Near East and South Asia, was really based on a lens of empire.
Said also said Orientalism presented imagery of a mysterious land full of secrets, monsters, and sensual women. But the depictions weren't just about exotification. Orientalist art and literature often served a more sinister purpose.
One of the most important ideas behind Orientalist art has been to show the Islamic world in a position of either moral or cultural inferiority to that of the West.
And according to Said, that desire to show Arabs and Muslims as morally less than had a very real impact on the everyday lives of people living in the so-called Orient, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. It doesn't just affect Arabs and Muslims, it can also affect Black Africans, Indians, and other Asians. Said's work dissected what media characterizations of Arabs and Muslims in Western news outlets looked like during and after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution.
It is from the mosques that opposition to the Shah is being led by puritanical Shiite Muslims. The religious zealots want to return to the Constitution of 1906.
The concept of Orientalism isn't just that there are issues with this painting or that novel, it's that this painting or that novel both create and perpetuate inaccurate portrayals of Muslims and Arabs. It dehumanizes dehumanizes anyone who falls into those groups and supports dangerous policies. And these stereotypes bring me back to Aladdin. The late Arab-American academic Jack Shaheen identified the Orientalist themes and tropes in Aladdin. After its 1992 debut, Shaheen campaigned to make Disney alter the opening song, Arabian Nights. And you probably don't remember this line.
Where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
Seriously, he just referred to a made-up Arab land as barbaric and put it to a children's beat. Shaheen responded in the LA Times and he said it was a painful reminder to 3 million Americans of Arab heritage as well as 300 million Arabs and others that the abhorrent Arab stereotype is as ubiquitous as Aladdin's lamp.
You might not be able to say that it's racist, but you can say it's a misrepresentation of cultures, and it's a blending of cultures, all to serve the purpose of sort of this mainstream American entertainment.
Shaheen also said these pictures would impact an audience's understanding of the Arab world and have a real-world impact with the negative portrayal of Agrabah serving as what he called Hollywood's fabricated Arab land. Well, he may be right. In 2015, as the US bombed ISIS in Iraq and Syria, a poll found that 30% of Republican voters would support bombing Agrabah. And before you agree, Agrabah is the fictional country in Aladdin. It's not real. Other activist groups criticized the film's character portrayal with Aladdin and Jasmine having anglicized features and American accents.
You're not free to make your own choices.
Sometimes you feel so...
You're just
trapped.
And the rest have really fake Arabic accents and far less attractive physical features.
I had to slit a few throats, but I got it.
But Aladdin is not the only film in recent memory to use Orientalist imagery. There's also Prince of Persia, Gods of Egypt, 300, Munich, Zero Dark 30, and American Sniper. But that didn't stop some of those from winning Academy Awards. You might say Aladdin is old news. Why bring it up at all? Well, it's coming back as a live-action feature, and it doesn't seem like much has changed at all. The movie's already been accused of whitewashing the story with the creation of white characters like Prince Anders.
If you're going to spend a lot of money on it, you can't really do anything real. It has to be imaginative, it has to play to fantasy, it therefore has to rely on stereotypes.
Orientalist imagery has also managed to creep onto the small screen. Television shows like Homeland and 24 are among the biggest culprits, with Arabs and Muslims often portrayed as terrorists or violent individuals hell-bent on destroying the United States and or Western civilization. Homeland in particular framed Muslims as people you could never trust under any circumstances, even if they were your neighbor. But the terrorist trope is an old one.
The most sustaining sort of Orientalist stereotype is that of the terrorist. And you can see that heavily present in 1970s, 1980s, both literature and film. And today we see that that has become still a dominant trope.
The Brave is NBC's latest military drama, where good versus evil clash, and the evil happens to be Muslims. But there also happens to be one good Muslim working with the good guys.
In many ways, you could say that Hollywood mainstream movies have become a lot more self-aware about this kind of thing, and so they try to change it up or add a little more complexity, for example, by adding in a Muslim good character as a way to sort of balance out a Muslim villain.
And then there are music videos where Orientalist images have been pervasive for a long time, but it's not as discussed as it is in other art forms. Which brings us back to Bodak Yellow's music video, where Cardi B shows up in Dubai, so mysterious, so rich, dresses up in Arab garb, so sensual, so exotic, has a pet cheetah, which is dangerous, rides a camel across a desert, aka every Arab's backyard apparently. Okay, so maybe Cardi has never even read Edward Said and may not even know what we're talking about, but in her defense, she's not the only one doing it. There are plenty of other examples of musicians using Orientalist images in today's music videos.
I see it as a form of sort of silencing. It's a form of erasure of a culture. It's oversimplification. And people have a right to be insulted by that, and they have a right to protest it and demand that they be treated with a little more respect.
So what will it take to ensure that we stop exoticizing Arabs and Muslims in our movies, TV shows, and favorite music videos? Love you, Cardi B. Growing up, whenever I watched Aladdin, I was somehow able to separate between that portrayal of Arabs and my own Arab family. Have you guys seen?
Okay, so how do we just bring all of this, what we've seen, together? Let's look at Edward Said's article. Orientalism is an imaginative geography, okay? And so we have to ask ourselves then, what feeds the imagination for European audiences when they thought about, when they conceived, when they, of the Middle East, okay? What was in other words, the kind of, well, as he says, the imaginative geography. But the point was it's unequal. Okay? There's the Orient, and the Orient, here I'm just putting words there, it was not only a symbol, it was a binary opposition to the Occident or West. Okay? The Orient was uniformly considered inferior. And of course, so that's based on the stereotype. And at the same time, not only inferior, but this kind of barbaric realm, which was also a source of fear. So look at the kind of image of the snake charmer. And the artist who painted this is the same as the same artist who painted the slave market, 1866, Jean-Léon Geron. And this could be an image that's on the exam. There's not much text underneath because there's I want you to go through the work of going through the readings to see why is this painting so important. If we could summarize Orientalism, how about the 3 E's? The Orient as exotic, as erotic, as esoteric, in other words, mysterious. Okay. And then there's always then the argument. Now, this is the argument. You take those 3 E's, okay, the exotic, the erotic, the esoteric. Does this also then ultimately lead to European cultures imagining these societies as the enemy? 3 E's leads to a 4th E. So, Jean-Léon Geron, 1866. It's been more than 30 years since the French conquest of Algiers and then the surrounding land. Okay. There is no slave market where women like this are sold. The painting is pre-modern, okay? You cannot mass produce a painting like this. Nevertheless, it has been reproduced on so many various forms to become that emblematic painting of that symbolizes Orientalism. On one level, the Middle East used to have slave markets, right? But it also is coming at a time, I mean, just 1 year, it's also meant to bring approbation to other countries that engaged in slavery. Remember, this is just 1 year after the American Civil War. Let's look at this painting. Okay. And here we have an article in 2011 referring to a graphic novel called Habibi, and looking at its relationship with the painting, The Slave Market. You see, what did that painting do? It shows the Orient as savage, right? Now, of course, because the French have conquered this, what is the assumption? Slave markets are no longer exist in Algeria. In other words, what did France do? It civilized Algeria. And this civilizing mission was euphemistically referred to as a white man's burden. In other words, the narrative, the European narrative, isn't we're conquering people, killing them, and exploiting them for their natural resources. No, 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 it's the other way around. It is, we are doing them a favor. It's our burden to show them modernity. In other words, it's our burden to give them the condition of mass, because once they have the condition of mass, they will have civilization. In other words, it's our burden to give them modern industry, to bring them and embed them into the modern market, because one day if they follow us, they too will be modern like us. And the implicit argument of the white man's burden is everyone wants to be modern. Okay. Now, remember the book I told you about, Do Arab Women Need Saving? What is the white man's burden? We will also save Arab women from Arab men. So the problem with this graphic novel by Thompson, which was produced in 2011, it repeats a lot of those Orientalist themes. Okay. Such as the following. Okay. The harem, the Oriental bath, and we'll see how the bath recurs as an image over and over again. The indolent harem with the Sultan. Okay. And of course, yes. Yeah, I mean, so in other words, it is just a modern version of the pre-modern painting, because Habibi was a graphic novel that was meant to be mass produced. Let's go to Egypt. If one person represents the white man's burden and Orientalism at the same time, it was Lord Cromer, the British administrator of Egypt. Okay. So what happened in the 1880s, 1882 to be exact? Egypt was invaded by Britain because it wanted to take over the Suez Canal. The government in Egypt didn't seem friendly enough to British interests, so the British simply invaded. Look at kind of the Orientalist ethos and the white man's burden in the following quote. Now keep in mind, not only is the ruler of Egypt, what else is he? He is also back in England and representative of the Victorian era, opposed to women getting the right to vote. He would be an anti-suffragist. Look how that influences the following. On the local preference of women being treated by women, he said, I'm aware that in exceptional cases, women like to be attended by female doctors, but I conceive that throughout the civilized world, attendance by medical men is still the rule. In other words, what did he refuse to do under his watch? Allow women to be examined by female doctors. And not only that, he curtailed opportunities for women to get a civilized Western medical education at the same time. Okay. And of course, what was Lord Cromer doing this in the name of? Well, we Brits are here to save the Egyptian women from the Egyptian men, and the only way they'll do that is if they become civilized like us. Okay. I talk about Lord Cromer, though, really to understand the world of Lacey Duff Gordon, or otherwise known as Lady Duff Gordon, okay? Because they're both products of the same time. So the primary source is basically, it's a description of her experience in Egypt. Now, how did she end up in Egypt? She was afflicted by the great pandemic of its time, and that was tuberculosis. And often the British weather was not conducive from recovering from tuberculosis. Usually to get over tuberculosis, you have to go to high altitude locations where the air is dry. And that's 0 places in England or even Scotland. Okay. Air, dry, and high altitude. So during her recovery, she goes to Egypt. Now look at the introduction of her book when it was published in 1902. In other words, Lucy Duff Gordon's book is very Orientalist. That's what makes it modern. It's mass produced, okay, number one. Number two, look at the introduction by a guy, of course, named George Meredith, and look at the kind of misogynistic patriarchy you see here. Now, in other words, he's trying to compliment Lady Duff Gordon. And look at this compliment. Humor as a beautiful women's defensive weapon is probably the best that can be called in aid for the bringing of suppliant men to their senses. Okay. So, in other words, not only is the kind of introduction of this book, we could say, inherently misogynistic, patriarchal. So, what is this book? It's a modern book. It's mass-produced. It's a product of imperialism. It is the imperials kind of observing life in the recently conquered lands, right? Now, I have to say, at this time, Egypt wasn't formally under British control. Egypt was more or less under indirect British control. Because when the Suez Canal was built, basically from that point onwards, Britain always interfered in British control. But what makes this Oriental? This is the following. Look at her letter from Luxor. It's January 13th, 1864. Okay. And look at this, because this is going to be a theme we'll be studying about. Orientalism is about the Western gaze, how the West looks at the Middle East. And here we have the Western gaze of a Western woman. And what is kind of a theme that she delves in, and kind of what were the parts that I copied and pasted into the primary source? The observation of what today in the Western sense what we would call belly dancing. Look how she describes the contortions of the first dancer, more or less grateful, okay? Then the captain calls out to Latifa. Now you have to remember, a lot of these performances were occurring on boats on the Nile, okay? And what is Nile? What is Latifa? Actually, it's ironic. Latifa means the cute one, but what does Lady Duff Gordon call her? The ugly girl became the serpent of the old Nile. The posture of a cobra about to spring. And now you have to keep in mind, this is the pre-modern. You see, the ancient serpent, this dance of the serpent, probably was performed going back to ancient Egypt, as far as we know. Of course, it's very hard to kind of, when doing the history of dance, to get primary sources about what dance moves were made. But most likely it was an ancient, pre-modern dance form that goes back to ancient Egypt. Okay. Now, what is she saying? And what is she shocked from her Victorian senses? The Arab men don't think it the least improper for a woman to dance. Okay. Of course, the girls don't commit any indecorum before European women, except the dance itself. In other words, what is she finding the dance? 1860, the fact of a woman dancing like this. It's a form of indecorum, yet she's captivated by it. Okay. Then she talks about one Sayyid Ahmed. Okay. What is a fantasia? A fantasia is just like a very elaborate play, performances, dances, both by men and women. Okay. And he said, I would arrange one for you, but I'm afraid you have men with you. Okay. And when he was annoyed that there were two Englishmen who wanted to make the girls dance naked, which they objected to. In other words, you know, the horny men wanting their kind of equivalent of the, I don't know, where do you call it when? Strip clubs, okay. This is an early modern version of what these men wanted, okay. And of course, Sayyid Ahmed was so angry, he kicked them out of the house. Now, the important thing is, where do we see the patriarchy here? And patriarchy can be, of course, a woman can communicate patriarchal values that well, it's on a couple levels. Not religious, not patriarchy of the state. This is the cultural realm. Calling her a wench, that's narrative patriarchy, right? That's the use of linguistic patriarchy, using specific words to insult women when there is no equivalent to insult a man. Okay. So here's a woman calling another woman, Latifa, a wench, calling her ugly, right? The societal is this: proper girls don't dance in public. Okay? In other words, Rather, so this is a pre-modern art form, but what is she saying? It is still improper. It's not what is considered proper decorum. Okay. And of course, remember the other part of Orientalism is this other modern phenomena of racism. And when I talk about modern racism, what characterizes it from its pre-modern form? Pre-modern, in other words, before the condition of mass. Okay. And remember, I went into a long discussion about this when we were doing the Arabian Nights. Okay. The modern racism, look at her obsession with the skin color, describing Sheikh Yusuf, coffee brown Arab skin. The focusing on, as unlike the lighter colored mulattoes or Malays who never change color at all. Then what does she want to do? She wants to take a picture of a Negro girl, and this was the other aspect of Orientalism. When the Europeans were going to document everything that they saw that was exotic through the new mass-produced medium of photography. If I can get a hold of a handsome falaha here, that's just a word for a peasant, I'll get a photograph to show you in Europe what a woman's breast can be, for I never knew it before I came here. It is the most beautiful thing in the world. The dancing girl, again, the fascination with the belly dance. Okay. Before it was even called the belly dance, I saw her move her breast by some extraordinary muscular effort. First one and then the other. They were just like pomegranates and gloriously independent of stays or any support. Okay. Again, this is the Western gaze on the kind of Orient as a performance, as a show. And I want you to compare this document to another that we'll look at later. This primary source, that is. Okay. You see, where's the white man's burden? Where does that term come from? Well, it comes from a writer named Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Book. And in his book, his poem, The White Man's Burden, the white man's burden was a celebration of the conquest of the Philippines by the US, okay, 1898. That's when he came up with the term. Now, if we look at kind of how Orientalism and racism and imperialism and colonialism are all part of a global historical phenomenon. Here we see Orientalism embedded in a soap ad. The first step towards lighting the white man's burden is teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And you see the kind of native bending, receiving soap from the civilizing, in other words, modern mass-produced soap from the civilizing white man. You see it in imagery like this. And I'm just trying to show you what was kind of the mass production, modern advertising of a mass-produced item around this time, soap. And of course, this gives you an idea of American advertising. There were two products that were also revealed during the 1893 Chicago Fair: Cracker Jack and Aunt Jemima. And if you know anything, Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben were two mass-produced commodities that came out of America's Orientalizing experience. Or in other words, the word aunt and uncle were terms of power, okay, to denote their mastery over, those were slave terms. Now, to understand the Chicago Fair then, you have to see that it was organized according to a racial hierarchy, okay, where the center of the Chicago Fair was the white city. Okay. But then, while that was the center, then there were outlining parts that were organized according to the colors of the various cultures, such as a red part of the city, in other words, for Native American culture, which was insignificant. The yellow part of the city for Asian cultures. And of course, so here was the white city, the center, the hierarchy, the most important part of the World's Fair. And one part of the World's Fair was anthropological, archaeological, ethnological studies being done, okay, at the World's Columbian Exposition. And if you look at the kind of white man in the hierarchy, here you see the other races, okay? In other words, I mean, if you literally look at a race, here you see the kind of dominant position of the white race versus the rest. The white versus the rest would be a very good way of describing Orientalism. So in terms of the Middle Eastern town, the brown town, okay, here it is, okay? And what did it promise you? So now where's the gendered relevance? If you go there you could see a Moorish harem. And what did the Moorish harem look like? Well, you would have dancing girls there. You would even see a sultan with his harem. And so what are we seeing? The harem becomes something that fascinates the European gaze of the Orient, okay? And it goes to kind of this Western fascination of look at the Middle Eastern man with his multiple women. So these were more or less basically kind of living museum pieces. The Orient alive for the onlookers. And here is the Syrian woman who was otherwise known as Little Egypt. And she had a dance theater. And notice, keep in mind, her belly isn't showing. There's silk around there. But this is the birth of the belly dance in the US. Now, if you look at this article called Dirty Dancing in Egypt, okay, let's break it down. To call somebody a son of a belly dancer in sentence number 1 is an insult, okay? That we could say is kind of linguistic patriarchy. When did Orientalism have its first start? It's when Napoleon invaded Egypt for 3 short years in 1798, okay? And produced this massive volume called The Description of Egypt, right? And look at again the patriarchy there. Women with no training or decorum, their dance movements, nothing more obscene than can be imagined. Okay? And look at the continuity there between the French scholars observing everything in Egypt and that British woman, about close to 60 years later, using the same reference, that these women have no decorum, but yet, look at the fascination with these women. And so what does Allah introduce is, again, in sentence number 3, how even dance can be orientalized. Okay? Compare the ballet with the belly dance, for example. And just so you know what happened to Napoleon, he stayed in Egypt for 3 years. The British defeated him. Okay? And that's the beginning of the kind of British interference in Egyptian affairs, but they don't formally annex Egypt. Well, I mean, they conquer Egypt with a military invasion in the 1880s and then formally annex it as a colony in 1914 on the eve of World War I. Now, look at Andrea Deegan, and what is she saying? Oriental dance poses a challenge to religiosity that sees any form of display as an act of impurity. In other words, belly dancing, on one level, is religious patriarchy. Now, in this case, religious patriarchy in modern-day Middle East, informed by Islamic religious patriarchy that sees it as amoral. But if we look in the 1860s, that was Christian morality. Okay? That was a form of religious patriarchy. And that's what makes belly dancing a subversive art. The dancer who shakes off the shackles of the patriarchal order strikes fear in the heart of religious conservatives. It's a way of resisting religious patriarchy. Hence its periodic repression. Now, by who? Egypt's ruler, Muhammad Ali. Okay, that's patriarchy of the state. Arresting and exiling belly dancers and considering the same as prostitutes, giving them 50 lashes. Okay. In other words, belly dancing is a pre-modern art form. What is this now? The beginning of a state that is using patriarchy of the state to regulate a woman's right to dance. Okay. Then go all the way into the 1960s, Egypt's president, Jamal Abdel Nasser. And notice it's funny how they call it Oriental dance, even though they are the Orient, because this is what Orientalism does. It forces the people who are Orientalized to take Western notions of Orientalism and they absorb it, they make it their own. Okay. Now, Oriental dance, lying on the back, lying on the ground to excite or make rapid movements to cause excitement. The thighs are not to be fully open while on the ground, no wobbling up and down. That's basically making belly dancing, again, another example of patriarchy of the state, making it illegal. So you can see all the levels of patriarchy in this article. State patriarchy, religious patriarchy, the patriarchy embedded in language. Okay. Now, look what the modern state is doing. When the minute the modern state basically tries to control the masses who want to dance by saying, you must get a permit from us to be able to dance. In the pre-modern era, when would a dancer ever go to a state and say, can you give me a permit? Those kind of things didn't exist back then. Okay. And here the state can determine if your costume is too provocative. That's again patriarchy of the state. And what does Allah call for at the end? In a real democracy, there's a place for every citizen, belly dancers included. In other words, in democracy, in the world that promises, mass equality, the belly dancers deserve a place at the democratic table as well. Okay, now that's kind of going fast forward to the present. Let's go back to the Comstock Act of 1873. And why do I want to talk about this particular act? The greatest, Comstock referred to this kind of social crusader who created a committee on vice. Okay. And what was the act? It was basically this. It was anything that was obscene, that was circulated in the mail, would be violating the law. Okay. But look in this case, the minute the Comstock Act comes into is enacted, here you have American patriarchy of the state. Okay. If you look at this primary document, okay, what else is it saying? Any material that related to birth control, okay, or causing unlawful abortion, that too is now illegal. Okay. That was the act he puts in 1873. And anyone who circulates any of this material, including doctors, will be imprisoned at hard labor for no less than 6 months, no more than 5 years. This is beginning a patriarchy of the state in the US. Okay. Of course, patriarchy in the state had always existed, but this is a new form. This is modern patriarchy of the state in the sense that it is trying to ban the mass circulation of medical information that they deem improper. All mass-produced books, pamphlets, newspapers, anything that is considered obscene, and even naked images of a woman's body for a medical textbook was banned under this law. This is the first, we could say, one of the first primary sources where you are trying to control the mass circulation of information dealing with abortion. Okay, what does this have to do with belly dancing? 20 years later, you see, the Comstock Act gave Comstock a wide mandate to persecute feminists and persecute belly dancers, okay, which he more or less, that became his new crusade in the 20 years later. Belly dancing for him was the equivalent of orgies on a stage. Now, let's go back to the Columbian Exposition. It was such a hit, the belly dancing, particularly Little Egypt, that it became a permanent fixture on Coney Island. The streets of Cairo became a place on Coney Island. Now look at all these men gathering. What are they listening to? A man like that would be called a barker. And what is a barker? Basically somebody who barks out, come and watch our show. Okay. Look at the barker for Little Egypt. Okay. And look at, and of course you have to realize this was kind of, if you want, the first equivalent before there was ever such things as strip clubs. But this was the place where men would go and, you know, be very secretive about it. Women would, their wives would be furious. Okay. But look at the things he would scream out, the Barker, to get people's attention. Okay. Look at his description of the belly dance. Being snake-like, vulgar, she sinks lower and lower, wriggling, twisting, jerking. And of course, what is this all for? This is, well, the patriarchy of the market. Bringing men to kind of ogle at dancing women who are exotic and from the Middle East. This Orientalism as well as patriarchy of the market. What else would the Barker say? Okay, so you can see these were various kind of what are written down, the primary sources of the way basically the Barker used to get the men's attention to come and watch the belly dancing. Crazy. Comstock wanted to shut it down. Okay. So there we have this whole kind of operation on Coney Island. This is what he considered a violation according to his Committee on the Suppression of Vice. By the way, this is their outfits. Okay, so you can see it was them dancing. And then we see the snake charmer as well. Now, a woman named Ida Craddock, basically, if Comstock was trying to shut this down, she came into the defense, saying it's the women's right to dance, that there's something beautiful in this dance. It's an expression of women's femininity and sexuality, and there's nothing wrong with that. And just so you know, she became kind of enemy number one of Comstock, and he persecuted her so much that, just to make a long story short, she could be considered one of the feminist pioneers, but so hounded she was. One of the first kind of American defenders of belly dancing, she eventually committed suicide. Not directly related to this course, but an example of one of the first modern feminists, Ida Craddock, defending this as an art form, that women have the right to do this. Okay. That patriarchy of the state should not get in the way of belly dancing. What did Comstock call this? A hoochie coochie dance. And even though it was meant to be an insult, okay, the name took off. Have you ever heard this song in the playground? Well, let me kind of show you what the song would be like. First of all, by the way, so what was this performance that caused such a scandal? Fortunately, we have video footage of it. The streets of Cairo, here we go. And let me just make sure the sound is on, sorry. Yep. So you can see now, look at the indecency, the orgy on the stage. Here it is. That's the hoochie coochie dance. There's a place in France where the naked ladies dance. Wait, that's the song? Where's the video? Sorry. Let me just get the video for you guys. Give me a second. Okay. Here we go.
Congress in Washington, D.C.
The horror. Yes,
This has been a
that's
presentation of the
it.
Library of Congress. Visit us at LOC.
That's what caused this all this reaction. That was considered kind of the live orgy on stage. But anyway. Okay, but so just to end, that is, who knew Paula belly dancing had such a long patriarchal contested history to it? Where it invokes on the various levels: religious patriarchy, patriarchy of the state, linguistic patriarchy, patriarchy of the market. That is all the realm of Orientalism, specifically focusing on the belly dance. The next lecture will be looking specifically at Orientalist art.